They wound the famous clock she had built with her own hands and called it another man's work, and the young woman stood silent at the back of the great hall in a plain grey gown while a roomful of fashionable strangers admired the wonder of Wexmoor, and never once said that the clock was hers, and they would not have believed her if she had, for they had been told she was nothing at all. Not even a daughter of the house, only a base-born ward the dead duke had taken in out of pity. They had taken her house and her father's dukedom and her father's name, and the very work of her own years, and when even that was not enough, they had taken the one thing no thief should have been able to take, which was her blood. They had stood up before the whole county and said that her own father had never been her father at all, and the county had believed them, because it is always easier to believe a lord and a lady than a silent girl in a grey gown. And Rosamund Fenwick let them, and kept her face still, and went on winding by her own hand, every night before the great house slept, the clocks her father had made and that no one else in all of Wexmoor knew how to keep, because she had learned that a wronged woman with no money and no protector and no name the world would credit has exactly two possessions left to her, her silence and her work, and she did not yet know that the great clock in the hall, which her dying father had made to do one last thing on one single noon in all the year, was about to do it in front of the very people who had robbed her, and that the cold proud man who was about to walk into the hall to buy it would be standing there to see. It was a bright cold morning in the last week of January when the cold Duke of Wexmoor came to Wexmoor to see the famous clock. And that morning is where I will begin, though Rosamund's story begins long before it, for everything that had been done to her over 3 slow years was about to be undone by a single noon, and a man exacting enough to look where no one else had thought to look. I have been waiting a long time to tell you Rosamund's story. The whole of it, the stolen name and the burned register and the cold room over the kitchens and the great clock that kept her father's truth in the dark, and the cold proud man who came to buy from a thief and stayed to find a wronged woman. So settle in, and stay close by her side through what is coming, because a young woman who has been called nobody's daughter for 3 years, and made to wind in silence the very clock she helped to build, is about to be made plain before the very people who could not be troubled to ask her a single question, and what she does when at last her father's clock speaks her name aloud, and what the man who first took her for a servant does when he learns whose mind built the thing he came to buy, is a thing worth staying for to the very end. But to understand how the true-born daughter of a duke came to be standing silent at the back of her own hall in a servant's apron while a room full of fashionable people admired her own stolen work, you have to understand what had been done to Rosamund Fenwick, and what she had been told she was, and what the world had been made to believe of her, for the better part of 3 long years. She had been the only child of the late Duke of Wexmoor, a learned and gentle and rather solitary man who cared more for the turning of the heavens and the deep mysteries of time than for the great world that bowed to his title, and she had grown up the cherished daughter of a great house, with the run of a long gallery full of her father's instruments, and a great hall where his finest clock stood, and the unthinking certainty of the well-loved child that the world was a safe place, and that she was somebody in it. Her own mother had died when Rosamund was very small, and so it had been father and daughter together at Wexmoor through her growing up, close as 2 wheels that turn upon one arbor, and the Duke had raised her himself, and had done one thing for his daughter that no one else among the great families of the county would have thought to do for a girl. He had seen, when she was very young, that she had it, that rare patient genius for the craft he loved, that she could hold the whole turning train of a clock in her mind at once, and feel the fault in a movement through her fingertips before she could see it, and better, could sit down before a heap of brass wheels and steel pinions and a length of mainspring and out of them make a thing that kept true time where a clumsier hand made only a thing that ticked, and instead of calling it a strange unwomanly taste and steering her toward the harp and the sampler, he had taken it seriously. He had taught her the deep crafts of horology and the mathematics of the heavens that lie beneath them, the cutting and the depthing of wheels, the making and the tempering of springs, the long fine disciplines of the clockmaker that even most clockmakers never master. And then, when she had outrun even what he could teach her, he had let her teach him, and had sat by her at the long gallery bench through the quiet candlelit evenings while she made things he could not have made alone, and had told her, more than once, in the plain certain voice she remembered all her life, that a true clock keeps the truth whether or not a soul is by to read it, that anyone might own a famous clock but that the truth of a movement comes up out of the hands that cut it and cannot be faked or bought or stolen, and that she had it, and must never let anyone tell her she did not. She had believed him, because she was happy, and because it was true, and of all the things her father made, and all the things he taught her to make, there was one that was theirs above the rest, the chief glory of Wexmoor and the wonder of the county. For over many slow years the Duke and his daughter had built together, wheel by wheel and tooth by tooth, and with a patience that ran on past the patience of ordinary men, a single great astronomical clock that did what no other clock in the county could do. It was a tall longcase of dark oak and bright brass that stood against the paneled wall of the great hall, and it told not only the hour and the minute true to the second, but the day of the week, and the date of the month on a slow ring, and the very turning of the year, and above its golden dial, in a painted arch, a silver disk showed the age and the phase of the moon, waxing and waning through the month exactly as the true moon did in the cold sky over the park. The county came from 30 miles to see it strike, and no one then alive, looking at the great clock keeping its faithful time against the wall of the hall, could have guessed that the proof of who Rosamund truly was, and whose daughter she was, and whose house Wexmoor was, lay hidden in the body of that very clock, set there by a dying man against the day his daughter would have need. For the late Duke of Wexmoor was a careful man as well as a clever one, and he had reason, late in his life, to be very careful indeed. The trouble had begun, as such troubles so often do, with a marriage. The Duke's first wife, Rosamund's mother, had been a gentlewoman of no great family, the daughter of a learned poor parson who had shared the Duke's love of the heavens, and the proud crane connection of the house. His late wife's people had thought her far beneath him, and had never forgiven the match, and when she died young, leaving him only the one small daughter, the Crane family had let it be understood, in the soft poisonous way of such people, that the less said of that unfortunate marriage the better. The Duke had borne their coldness for his daughter's sake, but he was a solitary man grown lonely, and some years on, when Rosamund was near grown, he had done a thing that gave the Cranes their opening. For he had quietly come to love and to marry a second time, a good and gentle gentlewoman as little to the Cranes' taste as the first, and being a private man who loathed the fuss and meant to present the thing to the world in his own good time, he had married her quietly, by license, with only 2 witnesses and the parson, and had not yet given it out to the county when his health, which had never been strong, began suddenly and sharply to fail. And that quiet unproclaimed marriage, which he had meant to announce in triumph in the spring, became instead, when the spring did not come for him, the very crack through which the Cranes would pour to take everything his daughter had. For the dukedom of Wexmoor, by the hard law of such things, could pass to a daughter and her line if she were Trueborn, but would go off to the cadet branch, to the late Duke's nephew if she were not, and the late Duke's sister-in-law had understood this for years, and had watched, and had waited. The Dowager Lady Wexmoor, Honoria Crane, was the widow of the Duke's elder brother and the mother of his nephew, a handsome, cold, proud woman of the proudest blood in the county, and not one penny of fortune of her own, who had married a younger son for love of the family name and been left a poor and bitter widow when he died, with a single idle son and a great deal of pride and a fixed unshakable conviction that the name of Wexmoor and its lands and its honors belonged by right to her own blood and had been, all these years, merely lent to a soft bookish duke who cared more for his stars than for his line. And her son Mr. Bertram Crane, the Duke's nephew, was an idle, handsome, vain young man of about 26, who had been bred from the cradle to expect a great inheritance, and had ordered his whole shape of life around the certainty of it, and the one thing, the only thing, that stood between Bertram Crane and the dukedom of Wexmoor was a quiet motherless girl, who knew more of clocks than of lawyers and had not a friend in the world to act for her. What they did the way clever cold people do, with patience and paper and a perfect smooth surface. The late Duke's health failed all that autumn, and into the long anxious weeks of his illness the Dowager Lady Wexmoor moved herself and her son to Wexmoor altogether, on the footing of a devoted family making themselves useful in a house of sickness, and she made herself, by soft relentless degrees, the mistress of the sick room, and the one person regularly admitted to her brother-in-law's bedside, and she nursed him with a great show of family duty and managed that his quiet new wife and his daughter were kept, more and more, from the room where he lay. And she watched, and she waited, and she laid her plans. For she had understood two things very quickly. She had understood that everything turned on whether Rosamund could be shown to be Trueborn, and that the proof of it, the entry of the late Duke's quiet second marriage, and before that the entry of his first marriage, and of Rosamund's own baptism, all written in the register of the small old parish church on the estate, was a thing that could be reached. And she had understood that the Duke, careful as he was, had told almost no one of the second marriage, so that if the right pages could be made to vanish and the right story told, there would be no one of any weight to swear against her. And so, in the last weeks of the Duke's life, while the dying man lay watched and silenced behind a door his sister-in-law controlled, the thing was done. The old parson of the estate church, a frail and frightened man near the end of his own life, was prevailed upon, by what mixture of money and pressure and fear was never fully known, to give up the register into the dowager's keeping for safety, and the register, when it was next seen, had been got at. The leaf that carried the late Duke's second marriage was gone, cut clean out at the binding. The leaf that carried his first marriage and Rosamund's baptism some years before was gone with it. And a story was put about, gently, regretfully, as a sad family duty, that there had alas been a sad irregularity in the late Duke's first connection, that the poor soft-hearted man, lonely after the lady's death, had taken in and openly cherished the daughter of that connection out of the goodness of his heart and a guilty conscience, calling her his ward and treating her in his fond eccentric way almost as a daughter, but that the girl, poor creature, had no true claim upon the name of Wexmoor at all, being base-born, as the want of any record of a marriage would, alas, only too plainly show. They said it with sorrow in their voices. They said it as a painful truth nobly faced. And the county, which had always thought the late Duke a queer reclusive man who let his motherless girl run wild among his instruments and never brought her properly out, found the story entirely easy to believe, and was rather touched by the proud family who had faced so awkward a truth so handsomely, and turned, almost overnight, from treating Rosamund as the daughter of the house to treating her as an embarrassment quietly tolerated, which was precisely what the Dowager Lady Wexmoor had paid for. The late Duke of Wexmoor died on a black morning in December, and Rosamund, who was kept from his bedside at the very last by her aunt's people, and did not reach the door until the bell was already tolling, did not at first even understand what had been done to her. She knew only that her father was gone, and that she had been kept from him at the end, and that on the morning after the funeral she was called into the great hall, where she had sat at her father's knee at the foot of the great clock as a small child, and was informed, by a sharp dry man of business her aunt had brought down from town, in a flat expressionless voice, of the terms on which she was now to live. The dukedom and the whole of the late Duke's estate, the man explained, passed, there being no true-born child, to his Grace's nephew Mr. Bertram Crane, now the Duke of Wexmoor, and the late Duke's ward Miss Fenwick. They had given her her mother's maiden name, Fenwick, as a kindness. The man said that she might not embarrass the family by using a name to which she had no right, would be permitted, out of the new Duke's charity and respect for his uncle's memory, to remain at Wexmoor as a companion to the Dowager and a help about the house, with a small allowance and a room, so long as she made herself useful and agreeable and gave no trouble, And when Rosamund rose, white and shaking, and said in a voice that would barely come that this was a lie, that her father had married her mother, that her father had married again, that there was a register, that the old parson would know, her aunt, the dowager, turned from the tall window where she had been standing in her handsome black, and looked at her with a sorrow so beautifully done that two of the servants believed it, and said gently that they had all feared the poor girl would take it hard, that it was natural she should have built up fancies of belonging, having been so kindly used, but that she must be sensible now, and grateful, and not distress herself and everyone else by laying claim to things that were not, and had never been hers. And the sharp man gathered his papers, and the new young duke lounged in the great chair and looked bored, and that was the moment, though Rosamund did not yet know it, when the trap closed. It is the cruelest thing in this whole story, I think, and I want you to sit with it a moment before we go on, because everything that follows turns on it. They did not merely take her house, they took the very fact of who she was. A woman robbed of her fortune may cry out that it was hers and be heard, but they had arranged the world so that if Rosamund cried out that she was her father's true-born daughter, the cry itself would only prove how sadly the poor base-born creature had been let to imagine herself a duke's child, and her aunt would shake her head over the pity of it and have her gently led away. They had not built her a prison of bars, they had built her a prison of her own erased name, and the want of a single page of paper. And there is no wall in the world harder to break than the absence of a thing that ought to exist. And this is why I want you to stay with me, and to stay with Rosamund, through the long middle of this story where it seems as though nothing can be done. Because I promise you a prison built of a burned page can be broken, but only by the one thing the builders never reckon on, which is that a careful man who loves the truth will sometimes hide a second copy of it in a place no thief would ever think to look. And Rosamund's father had hidden the truth very well indeed. And so within a year the cherished daughter of Wexmoor found that she had become, by slow degrees and without any single moment she could point to, a dependent in her own former home, then a poor relation, and at last very nearly a servant. The good old servants who had known her from a child were turned off one by one, on this pretext and that, and replaced with the dowager's people, who had been told that Miss Fenwick labored under sad delusions of grandeur and were not to attend to anything she said. The fine rooms of the house were closed to her, and she was moved up, by quiet stages, to a cold small room over the kitchens. And Rosamund was given to understand, kindly, that since she was so unaccountably clever about the late Duke's clocks, and since it would be a great pity for the famous Wexmoor clock and all the others to fall out of order and a great expense to bring a clockmaker down from town to wind and regulate them, she should make herself useful and earn her bread by keeping the clocks of the house herself, going round of an evening to wind and set and tend them, for which service she received her cold room and her board below the family and the privilege of being grateful. The poor base-born ward who had become the house's clock-winder, that was what she was made, and the county thought it a charming and a touching arrangement, and admired the family for their kindness to her, and never once wondered why a girl who had no head for anything fit could be trusted to keep the most intricate clock in the kingdom in perfect order. She bore it. She bore it because there seemed nothing else to do, and because grief had hollowed her out, and because some part of her, the part that had been a happy loved child at her father's bench, could not quite believe that the world she had been promised was safe had turned on her so completely. She bore it with a straight back and a still face and a great growing silence inside her, where a life had once been. And she bore it in the end, for one reason above all the others, which was the clocks, and the great clock most of all. For they had given her, thinking it a small humiliation, the one duty in all of Wexmoor she would have asked for if they had let her ask. They had handed the silent keeping of her father's clocks, the work of his hands and hers, into her own care and shut the door on her, and called it a servant's task. And every night, when the house was quiet, Rosamund went round the dim rooms by candlelight with her father's worn turnscrew in her apron pocket, and wound and tended the clocks he had made, and came last of all to the great hall and stood before the tall clock that was the wonder of the county, and wound it, and listened to it keep its faithful time, and felt for a few minutes in the dark near to him again. And the great clock, which did not read registers and did not listen to gossip, and did not care whose name was on the deed, kept its true time under her hands, as it had always kept it, so that the famous clock of Wexmoor went on keeping the heavens and the hours to the second under the care of the young woman they said was nobody, and was the wonder of the county still. And here I must tell you the thing that turns this story from a sorrow into a reckoning, and I will not keep you waiting for it the way some stories keep you waiting, because you have stayed with me this far and you have earned it. The famous clock had become, under the new master of Wexmoor, a thing to be shown off and, very soon, a thing very nearly to be sold. For the new Duke of Wexmoor and his mother had got the dukedom, but they had not got with it the one thing that keeps a great estate above water, which is the sense not to spend, and within 2 years of the old Duke's death the new Duke was deep in fashionable debt, with his racing and his card tables and his townhouse and the proud dowager with him. And the great house began quietly to be stripped of its movable wealth to feed their creditors and their habits. The pictures went first, away to London out of the long gallery, the old plate went after, and then the new Duke, who had grown vain of the one truly famous thing he had come into, fixed upon a notion that was to be the seed of his undoing. For he found that men of fashion and men of science alike spoke of the great Wexmoor astronomical clock as one of the marvels of the age, and that great collectors would give a very long price indeed to own such a thing or even to have such a maker's work, and he began to dream of the celebrity and the money that the famous clock and the famous name might bring him. But here was the difficulty, and here too was the seed of his ruin. The new Duke of Wexmoor knew nothing whatever about clocks, and cared less, and his mother knew nothing either, and a great collector or a serious man of science does not stand and admire a marvel of horology on the word of an idle young lord, who cannot tell him the first thing about how it goes, but wants to hear it discoursed upon by one who understands it, who can speak to its making and its principles and stand behind it. And so the new Duke did the thing that was to undo him in the end, the thing that clever idle people so often do, which was to take the knowledge he lacked from the one person he had robbed of everything else, for he made it understood, about the county and among the collectors who came, that the famous clock was in his own keeping and under his own improving care, that he had inherited not merely the great Duke's clock, but a good measure of the great Duke's understanding, and that he, the new Duke, was the man to speak to of it. He had a bright new plate of brass made and screwed to the case of the great clock, beneath the dial where the old maker's plain mark had been, and the new plate read that the clock was kept and improved by his grace the present Duke of Wexmoor, and he learned by heart a few fine phrases about the heavens and the hours, and stood before the great clock in a beautiful coat receiving the admiration of his visitors, and let it be thought that the marvel was half his own, while Rosamund, the true maker, who had built the thing with her father and alone of any soul living knew how it went, stood silent at the back in her grey gown, having been brought in to be on hand should the great clock want setting before company, and watched a room full of strangers praise her cousin's understanding over the work of her own hands, and said nothing, because to speak was to invite the kind sorrowful look and the gentle leading away, and because there was no one in the world who would have believed the base-born clock-winder over the charming young Duke of the house. For 3 years she lived so. 3 years of standing silent at the back of her own hall while the work of her years and her father's was praised under another's name. 3 years of winding by night, with her own careful hands, the clock that was shown by day as another man's marvel. 3 years of being called nobody's daughter in the house where she had been everybody's darling, and she told no one, and she cried out to no one, not because she had given up, but because she had learned the shape of her prison, and knew there was no use beating on those particular walls, and she did the one thing they could not stop her doing, which was to keep faith with her father's clocks, and with his memory, and with the truth, and to wait. For her father, at the very last in the few stolen moments her aunt's vigilance had not quite managed to deny them, had given her 2 strange instructions that she had not understood at the time, and that she had turned over in her mind 1,000 times in the long cold nights since, and though she did not yet know what they meant, she had kept them. The way you keep the last words of someone you loved, against the day they would come clear. The first instruction her father had given her, in one of the last clear hours of his life, when his sister-in-law had been called from the room and they were, for a few minutes, alone, had been about the great clock. He had taken her hand, and he had been very weak. But his eyes had been clear and urgent, clearer than they had been in days, and he had told her that whatever happened, whatever was said, whatever anyone told her she was never on any account to let the great clock in the hall be sold or stopped or carried away from Wexmoor, that she was to keep it, and wind it and stay near it, and above all that she was to keep it always running, and never, never let it run down. For a clock that is run down, he said with the ghost of his old smile, cannot keep its appointment. She had thought then that it was only a dying maker's love for the chief glory of his life's work, and a father's wish that his daughter keep the one beautiful thing they had made together, and she had promised, and she had kept the promise, fiercely through everything, winding the great clock faithfully every night and refusing with a mute stubbornness that the household took for one of her sad fancies to let that one clock go, however high the offer or however pressing the debt, until even the new duke, who would have sold it twice over, had given it up as not worth the trouble of a scene with the strange creature who kept the clocks, and let the great clock stand on against the wall of the hall, keeping its true time, exactly where the dying man had meant it to stand, waiting. And the second instruction her father had given her was stranger still, and she had understood it even less. He had told her in that same last clear hour to mind the noon of her own birthday. He had said it just so, mind the noon of your birthday, and had made her promise to be in the great hall, alone if she could manage it, at the very noon of the day she was born, which fell in the deep of the winter, and he had said, with the last of his strength and the ghost of his old smile, that the clock would keep an appointment with her on that day that it kept with no other, and that she would understand, when the time came, a thing he could not say to her now with other ears so near the door, and that until then she was only to trust him, and to keep the clock wound, and to be there at noon. She had wept, and thought his mind was wandering at the last into the gentle nonsense of a dying man, and had promised that too. And in all the 3 hard years since, the deep of 2 winters had come and gone, and on the noon of her birthday she had indeed gone and stood, when she could slip away before the great clock in the hall, and had watched it strike the hour of noon exactly as it struck every other noon of the year, and had seen nothing, and understood nothing, and had begun in her lowest moments to fear that he had meant nothing after all, that it had been only the wandering of a dying mind. She did not yet know that her father had been a maker of clocks to the very marrow of him, and that he had used, for his last message to her, the same patient cleverness he had used all his life upon his wheels, nor that the appointment the great clock kept on the noon of her birthday wanted not only the right day and the right hour, but a thing that had failed, by the cruelest small chances, to fall right on those 2 winter noons she had stood before it, nor that this 3rd winter the chance would fall right, and that there would be, this time, the right eyes in the hall to see it. Before that day comes, though, while Rosamund stands waiting and faithful at her father's clock in the dark of the early mornings, and the whole cruel design of her life is laid out plain before you, let me ask one thing of you, because the next part of her story is the part where everything begins at last to turn, and I would not want you to miss the turning. If you've made it this far into Rosamund's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. There, that is the only time I will ask. Now come back to the great hall, because the carriage is at the gate. The Duke of Wexmoor was a name the county knew and did not love. Adrian Vane, the young duke, was a man of about 34, grave, exacting, and very rich, the master of a great estate 2 days' journey to the north, and he had a reputation, among the fashionable people who had tried and failed to charm him, for being cold. He did not dance attendance on hostesses. He did not flatter. He did not suffer a fool or a fraud for the sake of being agreeable. And he had a way of looking at a thing, or a person, with a long level gray-eyed attention that took its true measure and was not to be put off by surface, which made shallow people uncomfortable and dishonest people afraid. They called him cold for it. In truth he was not cold but exact, a serious private man who cared for very few things, and cared for those few with his whole considerable heart, and the chief of those few things, the one passion of his guarded life, was the science he had loved since he was a boy, which was the study of the heavens and the making of the instruments that measure them. He was, though the fashionable world did not trouble to understand it, one of the first astronomers and horologists of the kingdom, a true student of time and the turning stars, a man who kept his own observatory and his own workshop not for show but for love and for knowledge, and he had as a young man deeply revered the late Duke of Wexmoor, with whom he had once exchanged letters on the depthing of wheels and the equation of time, and had grieved at his death and had wondered more than once in the years since what had become of the famous Wexmoor clock and of the daughter the old Duke had once mentioned, in a letter Ravensmere still kept, with a pride so peculiar and so warm that it had stayed in the younger man's memory all these years. What had brought him to Wexmoor on that cold, bright morning at the end of January was the clock. Word had reached him, as it reached every serious man in the kingdom, that the wonders of Wexmoor were coming, one by one, onto the market, and that the new Duke might be brought to part even with the great astronomical clock for a long enough price, and the Duke of Ravensmere, who wanted no ordinary timepiece but had heard all his life of the unmatched Wexmoor clock that kept the heavens and the hours together as no other in England did, had written and been answered, and had come himself, as he did all things of importance, to see and to judge before he bought. He did not of course know the half of what he was walking into. He knew only that he was to be received by the new young Duke of Wexmoor, who was said to be the late Duke's heir and the keeper of his work, and he had come prepared to find if not a fellow master, then at least a serious custodian who could talk of the great clock with understanding, and to buy, if it was all it was said to be, the finest piece in England. He was met at the door by the new Duke of Wexmoor in a coat of the latest cut with a great deal of fobs and seals, and by the proud Dowager Lady Wexmoor all stately civility, and was made much of, and given wine, and led at last into the great hall where the famous clock stood against the paneling, and it was there, within the first quarter of an hour, that the whole careful fraud of 3 years began, very quietly, to come apart, for the simple reason that the Duke of Ravensmere knew exactly what he was looking at, and the new Duke of Wexmoor did not. For Ravensmere, standing before that great clock, was as near to happy as he ever came, in the presence of a true thing truly made, and he did what such a man cannot help doing, which was to ask questions, real questions, a master's questions, about this clock and how it went, how the calendar work was carried, how the moon's age was kept so true across the months, how the equation of time was reckoned, what the Maker had done about the long fault that besets all such movements. And the new Duke of Wexmoor, who had learned by heart a dozen fine phrases and not one true thing, floundered. He smiled, and waved his beautiful hand, and said that the secret was all in the genius of the late Duke, his uncle, and that he himself kept it regulated to a nicety, and that these were deep matters not easily explained to a layman. And Ravensmere, listening with that long level attention, his face growing graver and quieter by the minute, understood within 10 minutes, with the certainty of one master measuring another, that the charming young man beside him did not know the first thing about the clock he claimed to keep, could not answer the simplest true question about it, did not so much as know a going train from a striking train, and was in plain fact a fraud. And then the great clock, as the hour drew on, made ready to strike, and the new Duke, eager to show off the one trick he was sure of, bade his guest attend, and the clock struck, and it was beautiful, the deep true sequence of it rolling out into the hall, and Ravensmere stood and listened to it with the pleasure of a man hearing a thing done exactly right. And when it was done, he turned to the new Duke with the first real warmth he had shown, and asked him, as one who understands such things to another, the one question that mattered, which was how in a movement of this age the strike had been kept so perfectly in step with the going across so many years. and the new Duke of Wexmoor, out of his depth and rattled and showing off, said something so wrong, so completely and ignorantly wrong about the working of the very clock he stood beside, that it was as though a man had claimed to have written a great book, and then held it upside down to read from it, and the Duke of Ravensmere went silent, and cold, and very still, and said nothing at all, because he had just understood, past any doubt, that this preening young lord had no more kept that great clock, or understood it, or been within a mile of making it, than he had set the stars in their courses, and that somewhere someone else had. And it was in that silence, looking about him for the truth that had to be there, that the Duke of Ravensmere first truly saw Rosamund. She had been there the whole while, of course, where she always was when company came to the great clock, standing quiet at the back of the hall in her plain grey gown, brought in to be on hand should the clock want setting. A shabby unregarded figure he had taken, when he noticed her at all, for some upper servant of the house, beneath his notice in the ordinary way of the world. But he was not, whatever the county said, an ordinary man, and he had learned to read fine work and the hands that make it, and watching now, with all his attention woken and suspicious, he saw what no one at Wexmoor had troubled in 3 years to see. He saw how she stood, the straight back, the still composure, the lifted head, that did not belong to a servant. He saw her hands, which, plain and ink-stained and work-worn as they were, had about them the particular sureness of hands that know fine mechanism from the inside. He saw that when the new Duke said his most ignorant things about the clock, the slightest flicker of pain, instantly mastered, crossed the quiet face at the back of the room, and he saw, above all, when the clock had struck and he had asked his master's question and the new Duke had blundered, that the silent woman at the back had gone very still, and that her lips had moved, just barely, shaping without sound the true answer the new Duke could not give, and then her grey eyes had lifted, and for one unguarded instant had met his across the crowded hall with a flash of such fierce, sorrowful, intelligent understanding, the look of one who knows a thing meeting another who knows it, that it went through him like cold water, and he knew, in that instant beyond his power to explain it, that he was looking at the person who had built that clock. He said nothing then. He was far too careful a man to show his hand in a house he did not trust. Before people he had decided within the hour were liars, he concluded his visit with a cold courtesy, said that the clock was indeed remarkable, and that he would consider his offer and write, and let himself be bowed out by the smiling new Duke and the stately dowager into his carriage, but he did not drive away. He had his man pull up beyond the gates, out of sight of the house, and he sat a long while, frowning, turning it over, for the Duke of Ravensmere could not abide an unsolved thing or a dishonest one, and here was both. And then he did a thing that was very unlike his cold reputation and entirely like his exact and honest heart. He resolved to find out the truth. He had heard, in the talk over the wine, the family's sad handsome story of the late Duke's base-born ward who was so oddly clever about the clocks and kept the house, and he had seen, at the back of the great hall, a silent woman with the bearing of a gentlewoman, and the hands and the eyes of a master, and the two pictures would not lie down together in his mind. And he meant to know why. Here is the place, I think, where you should understand the man a little better, because the county had him wrong, and so at first did Rosamund, and a great deal of what is coming turns on his being understood. The world called the Duke of Ravensmere cold, and pointed to his silences and his refusals and his terrible exactness as proof of it, and the world, as it so often is, was exactly wrong, for it had mistaken the manner for the man. He was not a man who felt little. He was a man who felt much, and early in his life had been taught, by some private grief the world never learned the whole of, that a careless heart and a careless tongue do harm, and had resolved, with the whole force of a serious nature, to be careful, and to be true, and never to say a thing he did not mean nor praise a thing that did not deserve it, and a man who will not lie, in a world that runs on small lies, is always called cold by the people whose small lies he will not tell. He had loved exactly two things wholly in his life, the memory of a good mother long dead and the pure pursuit of his science, and into that science he had poured all the warmth that a colder man would have spent on flattery, and a falser one on conquest. And it had made him, by 34, the most honest man and one of the loneliest in the kingdom. And this is the thing the Dowager Lady Wexmoor, with all her cold cleverness, had failed entirely to reckon on when she let into her house a man whose whole nature was an instrument for telling the true from the false. She had built a fraud of perfect smooth surface, calculated for a world of people who do not look closely, and she had admitted to it the one man in the county who looked closely at everything. And here, before we go on, is the second thing you should understand. The thing that the whole long middle of the story turns on. And it is this: that the small daily cruelties Rosamund had borne for 3 years were not, as they seemed, a string of separate slights, the natural unkindness of proud people to a poor dependent, but one single deliberate design, thought out from the first and held to without a flaw. The Dowager Lady Wexmoor had not merely failed to be kind to her brother-in-law's daughter. She had set out, coldly and with her eyes open, to steal a dukedom. And she had understood from the beginning that to do it she must do more than reach a register and tell a lie. She must make the lie unbreakable, and the way to make a lie unbreakable is to arrange that the truth, when it is told, will sound like the very thing the lie has prepared the world to expect. She had not slandered Rosamund's birth and then, separately, made her a servant. She had made her a servant because a servant claiming to be a duke's daughter is pitiable and absurd, and pity and absurdity are the strongest locks there are. She had not by carelessness let it be put about that the girl was strange and clever about the clocks. She had encouraged it, because the more the girl's one real gift was made to seem a harmless eccentricity, the less anyone would ever ask the dangerous question of where a base-born ward had learned to build the finest clock in the kingdom. Every humiliation had a purpose, and the purpose was always the same: to make Rosamund's truth unsayable. And against that one cold, flawless design there now stood, all unknowing, two people: a wronged woman who had kept faith with the truth in silence for 3 years, and a cold, proud man who could not rest while a lie stood unbroken in front of him, and the design, which had been built to withstand a world of people who do not look, had no defense at all against two who do. The Duke of Wexmoor went home to the north, and to all appearances did nothing. He wrote a cool civil letter saying that he was considering his offer for the clock, which kept his foot in the door and his name welcome at Wexmoor. But behind the cool letter he set quietly to work. In the patient, thorough way he did all things, and he set his man of business to it. A steady, discreet, weathered man named Mr. Whitlock, who had served him 20 years and asked no questions beyond the ones his master wanted answered. The Duke wanted answered first of all the simplest and most damning question there is, which is the question of where the people went, for he had learned in a long life of looking closely that when a great wrong is done quietly in a great house, there are always servants turned off who knew too much, and a lawyer suddenly dispensed with, and a witness or two gone conveniently away, and that these scattered inconvenient people, gathered up and gently asked, will between them tell you everything the smooth surface was built to hide. And so Mr. Whitlock went down into the county, not to Wexmoor but to the villages and the towns round about it, and began without any noise to find the people the Dowager Lady Wexmoor had thought safely scattered, the old servants turned off in the first year after the late Duke's death, the family solicitor who had been so suddenly dismissed, and above all, anyone still living who had known the truth of the late Duke's marriages. He found first the old solicitor. Mr. Alfred Sefton had been the late Duke of Wexmoor's careful countryman of law for 30 years. A gray-haired, honest, precise old gentleman who had drawn the late Duke's affairs and known his mind, and he had been turned from the door within a month of the Duke's death, on the cold word that the family's business was now in other hands, and had retired, hurt and uneasy and unconsulted, to a small house in the cathedral town nearby. And when the Duke of Wexmoor's discreet man of business came to him and asked, carefully, what he knew of the late Duke's family, the old man, who had carried his unease and his suspicions in silence for 3 years because no one of any weight had ever asked him, and a lone old country lawyer cannot move against a duke on suspicion alone, opened his heart at last. He had never, he said, believed in the sad story of the base-born ward, not for one moment, for he had himself, years before, seen and held the register entry of the late Duke's first marriage, and of Miss Rosamund's baptism, drawn by the old parson in his own hand, and the late Duke had spoken to him of his daughter always and only as his true-born child and heir. More than that, in the last year of the Duke's life, the Duke had come privately to Mr. Sefton, troubled and urgent, and had told him in confidence that he had quietly married again a good woman, and that he meant to declare it soon, and had asked the old lawyer's counsel on the settling of things, and then the Duke had sickened, and Mr. Sefton had been shut out of the sick room by the Dowager and turned from the door at the death, and had never been able to do a thing about any of it. He had the firmest belief, he said, that there had been foul work with the register. But belief was not proof. The leaves were gone, the old parson was dead, and an old country solicitor's word that he had once seen an entry that no longer existed would weigh as nothing in any court against a duke in possession, and a register that showed a blank. He could swear to what he had seen. He could not put the vanished page back into the world. And without the page, or some proof as good as the page, the truth would die with the few old people who remembered it, exactly as the Dowager Lady Wexmoor had designed that it should. The Duke of Ravensmere, when his man brought him all this, felt the case settle in his mind into a shape at once clearer and harder. He believed now, on the old lawyer's word and on the evidence of his own eyes in the hall, that the silent clockwinder of Wexmoor was the late Duke's true-born daughter, robbed of her name and her birthright by a cold and clever woman and a burned page, and the believing of it moved him, this exact and guarded man, more than he would have thought any wrong done to a stranger could move him. For he had revered her father, and he could not bear that a true thing should be unmade by a lie, and there was, though he did not yet name it so even to himself, something in the memory of that one fierce, sorrowful, intelligent look across the hall that had lodged in him and would not be dislodged. But believing was not proving, and the proving looked very near impossible. The page was burned. The parson dead. The witnesses to the second marriage not to be found. The law on the side of possession. And it was at this point, casting about for any thread that might serve, that the Duke of Ravensmere remembered two things at once. The late Duke's letter, years old, that he still kept, speaking of his daughter with that peculiar warm pride, and a single odd phrase in it that he had never understood, and that now, with all he had learned, came back to him and would not leave him be. For the late Duke of Wexmoor, in that old letter on the depthing of wheels and the keeping of true time, had written near the end a sentence that had seemed at the time only the fond flourish of a clock-mad father, and that the Duke of Ravensmere, reading it again now by his own fireside, read with a slow-rising attention. My daughter, the late Duke had written, has helped me to a clock that keeps better faith than men do, and I have taught her, against the day she may have need of the lesson, that a clock may be made to keep not only the hour, but an appointment, and to keep it faithfully on its own day though every other day in the year go by unmarked, and to give up, on that one day and to the one who knows to wait for it, a thing it has held safe through all the rest. The Duke of Ravensmere set the letter down, and sat very still and felt the cold, clever, electric certainty of a man of science who sees, all at once, the shape of an answer. The old Duke had hidden something in the clock. He had said as much, years ago, in a letter he could not have dreamed would ever be read against this need. He had built into the great clock some piece of mechanism that would do a thing on one particular day of the year and no other, and give up on that day something it had held safe, and he had taught his daughter to wait for it. The proof that was not in the register, the proof the Dowager Lady Wexmoor had been so sure she had destroyed, the careful clock-making man had made a second time. In the one form she would never think to search, and could not have read if she had. He had hidden it in the going of the great clock itself. The Duke of Ravensmere did not, being the man he was, go off half-cocked on a guess, however brilliant. He sent his man of business back into the county to find the last and most important of the scattered people, the one who, if any single soul still living knew the secret of the clock, would be the one to know it, the late Duke's old workman. For the great Wexmoor clock had not been wholly the work of the Duke and his daughter alone, in the heavy labor of it. The forging and the rough cutting, they had been helped for years by a faithful old journeyman clockmaker of the estate, a man named Josiah Tench, who had worked at the late Duke's bench since the Duke himself was young, and who had been, the old solicitor thought, turned off with the rest after the death. Mr. Whitlock found him at last, old Josiah Tench, near 70 now and poor, living with a married niece in a town a day's ride from Wexmoor, his hands stiff but his memory clear. And when the Duke of Ravensmere himself, who would trust so weighty a thing to no one else, came quietly to see him, and told him plainly who he was and what he believed and what he meant to do, the old man wept, and then he talked, for the first time in 3 years, of the thing he had carried alone. He had been there, old Tench said, at the very end. In the last weeks, when the master was failing and the house had gone over to the dowager and her son, the master had been frightened, not for himself but for his girl. He had seen which way the wind set, had understood that his quiet new marriage was unproclaimed and might be denied, had even, the old man thought, got some wind of trouble with the register, though he could not move openly with his sister-in-law's people all about him. And in those last weeks the master had sent, secretly by night, for his old workman Tench, whom the dowager's people thought nothing of, an old servant about the clocks, and the two of them, the dying Duke and the old journeyman, had done a thing together in the great hall in the dead of 2 or 3 nights, with the door watched and the work hidden. The master had had Tench take down the great clock's heavy driving weight, the dull lid plumb that hung on its line to pull the going train, and he had had its lead bored and hollowed, and into the hollow had laid a sealed packet of papers wrapped close in oiled silk, and the lead run smooth over it again, so that the weight that hung in plain sight in the case, that anyone might look at 100 times, was loaded at its heart with the master's secret and gave no sign of it. And then, old Tench said, the master had done the cleverer thing, the thing only such a maker could have done. He had altered the calendar work of the clock, with his own failing hands and Tench to fetch and hold cutting and setting a small concealed piece, a detent and a lever hidden among the year wheels, so contrived that on one single date in all the year, at the true noon of that one day, the slow year wheel coming round would trip the hidden lever and spring open a small secret drawer the master had built behind the silvered moon dial in the arch, and into that little drawer the master had laid a thin plate of brass, engraved fine in his own hand, that named his daughter Rosamund his trueborn and only child and heir, and bade her, when the clock should give it to her, look to the weight, and the one date the clock was set to keep, old Tench said. The one noon in all the year on which the great clock would open its secret to her, was the date that was both the day of the master's quiet second marriage and, by a chance, the master had wept over as a mercy, the very birthday of his daughter, for he had said to Tench, holding the little engraved plate in his shaking hand, that if he could not live to give her back her name himself, the clock should give it to her on her own birthday, in his own hand, when she was grown able to bear it, and that a true clock keeps the truth whether or not a soul is by to read it, and would keep this truth safe in the dark through every liar in the county until the one noon in all the year it was made to speak. And now at last you understand, as Rosamund herself did not yet understand, why those 2 winter noons she had stood faithful before the great clock on the morning of her birthday and seen nothing had passed empty. For old Tench, pressed by the Duke of Ravensmere, remembered the last cruel nicety of it. The hidden detent was tripped by the true noon. The master had been most particular on it. The true noon by the sun and the heavens, which a clock keeping meantime, as all good clocks do, does not show at the same instant the year round, the difference being that very equation of time the master had spent his life upon, and more. The trip would only fall right if the great clock were exactly in beat and had not, even once in the long year, been let to run down and be restarted even a little off, for the running down and restarting of such a clock throws its reckoning of the date by a day or more, and the appointment, missed by a day, is missed for a whole year. On the first of those 2 birthdays, old Tench reckoned, The clock had been stopped and restarted that autumn when the new Duke had had it moved a few feet along the wall to suit his furnishing, and its reckoning of the date thrown out, so that its noon of the appointed day fell a day late, and Rosamund, standing before it on the true day, had seen nothing. On the second, the hard frost of that winter had thickened the clock's oil and dragged its going a little slow across the months, enough to push the trip past the noon she watched. But this third winter, old Tench said, his old eyes bright, if the girl had kept her promise and kept the clock faithfully wound and running and in beat all the year, as her father had begged her above all things to do. And if the clock were sound, then this third birthday noon the appointment would fall right at last, and the great clock would do, before whatever eyes were in the hall, the thing it had waited 3 years in the dark to do. The Duke of Wexmoor rode back to the north with the whole shape of it clear in his mind, and a cold bright purpose in his heart. He knew now what the clock held and how it would give it up. He knew that the date was at hand, for Rosamund's birthday, he had learned, fell in the last week of January, only days off, and he understood, with the particular pleasure of a man who loves a thing done exactly right, that the trap the Dowager Lady Wexmoor had built so cleverly was about to be sprung by the one mechanism in the world she had no power over, the honest going of an honest clock. But he understood, too, that it must be done rightly, and witnessed, and made proof against every denial, for he knew his enemy now, and knew that a cold clever woman with a dukedom to lose, faced with a drawer springing open and a plate of brass, would not crumble but would fight, would cry forgery and tampering, and the mad fancies of the base-born ward, unless the thing were done before so many eyes, and the right eyes that no denial could stand. And so the Duke of Wexmoor laid his own quiet plan with the patience he gave to all serious things. He wrote to the new Duke of Wexmoor a warm and flattering letter, saying that he was now very much disposed to buy the great clock at the long price named, and that he would do himself the honor of coming again to Wexmoor to conclude the matter and take final delight in the marvel before it left the county, and naming for his visit, with a careful carelessness, the very date of Rosamund's birthday, and the hour of noon. And he so arranged it, by further civil letters, and by the standing of his name, that the conclusion of so famous a sale should be a small occasion, with a few persons of weight in the county invited to see the great Wexmoor clock pass to the great Duke of Wexmoor among them, though Wexmoor did not know he had a hand in it, the old solicitor Mr. Sefton, and an upright magistrate of the county whose honesty was known, and one or two others whose witness no one would dare to doubt. The Dowager Lady Wexmoor, scenting only money and consequence, was delighted, and set about preparing a handsome mourning, and so it was that she herself, with her own cold clever hands, arranged to gather into the great hall of Wexmoor, on the one noon in all the year that the clock would speak, and all unknowing, the very audience before whom her 3 years' work was to be undone. I want to slow us down now. Here on the threshold of the day everything turns, because we have come a long way at Rosamund's side and through a great deal of patient cold cruelty, and the turning, when it comes fast, and I would not have you miss a moment of it. So let us be in the great hall of Wexmoor on the morning of the last week of January, on the cold bright morning of Rosamund Fenwick's birthday, which she had not let herself remember was her birthday, because birthdays were among the things that had belonged to the girl she used to be. The hall had been made fine for the great occasion. The new Duke of Wexmoor in his best coat, all smiles, certain only of the long price coming and the consequence of selling to so famous a man, the Dowager Lady Wexmoor in handsome dove gray, stately and gracious, the very picture of a great lady honored, the few invited persons of the county standing about the hall in their winter finery, admiring, the great clock against the paneling, gleaming, wound faithfully the night before, as it had been wound every night for 3 years, by the silent woman in the gray gown who stood now, as she always stood when the clock was shown, unregarded at the back, having been told to be on hand should the marvel want any small setting before it was sold away from her forever. She did not know what the day was to bring. She knew only that they were selling the last and dearest thing, her father's great clock, the one piece of him she had left, and that she was to stand by and watch it go. And she had set her face still and her back straight and was bearing it, as she had borne everything, in silence. And only she, of all the people in that bright hall, knew that it was her birthday, and remembered. With a dull old ache she had given up expecting anything of, that her father had once told her to mind the noon of this day. The Duke of Ravensmere arrived, grave and exact and courteous, and was received with great honor, and made his slow way up the hall toward the clock, exchanging cool civilities, his long gray eyes missing nothing, and as he came he marked, without seeming to, two things: the silent woman at the back, whom he did not so much as glance at twice for fear of betraying her, and the slow hand of the great clock creeping up toward the hour of noon. He had timed his coming to a nicety. He let the new duke conduct him to the clock, and praise it in his ignorant phrases, and name the long price, and the Duke of Ravensmere, who could have bought the thing 10 times over and meant never to buy it at all, played out the part, and asked his grave questions, and let the minutes run, drawing the whole company in about the great clock with the gravity of his attention. So that without quite knowing why they did it, the new duke and the dowager and all the invited county were gathered close about the tall clock in the moments before noon, their eyes upon it, exactly as the Duke of Ravensmere wished them to be. And at the back of the hall the silent woman in grey, drawn by she knew not what, took a step nearer too, her eyes going, as they always went, to her father's clock, and the great hand climbed the last minute toward the top of the dial, and the Duke of Ravensmere, watching the woman's face and not the clock, saw the moment she remembered, saw the slow widening of her gray eyes as some old buried instruction stirred in her, "Mind the noon of your birthday," and saw her lips part. And the great clock of Wexmoor began to strike noon. It struck the hour full and deep and true, the long rolling sequence that had been the wonder of the county for 30 years, and the whole company stood and listened, charmed. And the new duke smiled his proprietor's smile, and the dowager inclined her stately head, and on the last stroke of noon, the true noon that the dying maker had set it to keep on this one day in all the year, there came from within the great clock a small sharp click, quite distinct, that none of them understood, and the little silvered door of the moon-dial's arch, that had seemed for 30 years a part of the painted face, sprang open of itself upon a tiny hidden spring, and a small drawer slid out from behind the silvered moon, and stopped, open, before them all, with a thin plate of bright brass lying in it. There was a silence in the great hall such as I do not think had ever been in it before. The new Duke of Wexmoor stared, his smile gone stupid on his face, not understanding. The invited county murmured and pressed closer, thinking it some marvelous trick of the famous clock, some last wonder of the great maker arranged for the show. And the Dowager Lady Wexmoor, whose cold cleverness was quicker than them all, went, in one instant, the color of ash, for she alone among the cranes understood at once that something had come out of the dark that was not in her reckoning, and she put out one hand, sharp, to take up the brass plate before anyone could read it. But the Duke of Ravensmere, who had been waiting 3 weeks for exactly that hand, was quicker, and his voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was the voice of a man no one in that hall would have dreamed of disobeying. "Let it lie, your grace," he said, "and let it be read where it lies, before us all, for I think the great clock has been kept waiting a long time to say this. And we should all of us do it the courtesy of listening." And he stayed her hand with his own, and turned to the upright old magistrate at his side, and asked him, as the honest man of the county, to be the one to read aloud what the clock had given up. The old magistrate, mystified and grave, took up the thin brass plate from the open drawer, and held it to the bright winter light from the tall hall windows, and read out into the dead silence the fine clear engraved words that the late Duke of Wexmoor had cut into it with his own failing hand against this very hour. "To my daughter," the plate said, "who alone keeps faith with the truth of this clock, and whom this clock now keeps faith with in return. I, being of sound mind though failing body, set down here in my own hand what wicked hands may try to take from her. Rosamund is my trueborn and only child, born in lawful wedlock of my first wife, and my heir in blood and in law, and I have lately and lawfully married again. Let her look to the weight that drives this clock, where I have laid the proofs of its safe against all liars. A true clock keeps the truth whether or not a soul is by to read it, and on this one noon of her own birthday I have taught it to give her back her name. So wrote her father, the magistrate read, the late Duke of Wexmoor, and signed it, and dated it, and the date was the date of the dying man's own hand 3 years before. I have tried, in the telling of many people's troubles, to find words for the moment when a long injustice breaks, and I have never quite found them, and I will not pretend to find them now, but I will ask you to look, in that frozen hall, not at the ashen face of the Dowager Lady Wexmoor, nor at the gaping ruin of the new Duke's smile, but at the silent woman in the gray gown at the back, who had been called nobody's daughter for 3 years, and who heard, read aloud by an honest man before the whole county in her father's own clear words, that she was her father's true-born child, and his only one, and his heir, and who heard her father's voice, in those few engraved lines, reach across 3 years and the grave to keep the promise he had made her with his last clear breath. Mind the noon of your birthday, and to give her back, on her own birthday, in the only way left to him, the name they had stolen. She did not cry out. She had not cried out in 3 years, and she did not begin now. She put one hand to the back of a chair, and stood very straight, and the tears ran down her still face without a sound, and into the silence she said, in a low clear voice that carried to every corner of the hushed hall, the first words she had spoken in that company in 3 years. I told them, she said. I told them there was a register. They said I was dreaming. And the whole hall turned as one, to look at the woman they had all been told was nobody. And saw her, for the first time, plain. What followed? The law and the proving of it took longer than a single bright noon, but it could only end one way now, for the dying maker had built his case as truly as he built his clocks, and had left nothing to chance. The Duke of Ravensmere, before them all, had the great clock's driving weight taken down, the dull lead plumb that had hung in plain sight pulling the going train for 30 years and had been looked at by 100 eyes and searched by none, and old Josiah Tench, brought up quietly from the back of the hall where the Duke had had him wait, his old hands shaking, showed where the lead had been bored and run smooth again, and the weight was opened, and out of its heart came the sealed packet wrapped close in oiled silk, dry and perfect after 3 years, and in it, exactly as the engraved plate had promised, lay the late Duke of Wexmoor's true marriage lines, both of them, the first and the second, and the very leaf of the parish register, cut out and carried off and thought destroyed, that the dowager's people had taken, but that the careful old parson, it now appeared, frightened and pressed but not wholly corrupt, had at the last given secretly to the Duke rather than burned, so that the Duke might hide the truth where his enemies could not reach it, the leaf that carried, in the old parson's own hand, the entry of the late Duke's first lawful marriage and the baptism of Rosamund, his true-born daughter. And with these lay the late Duke's own sworn and witnessed confession, written in his last illness and witnessed by old Tench and one other, setting out the whole of it, his marriages, his daughter's true birth, his fear of what his sister-in-law might attempt, and his charge to whoever should one day open the clock to see his daughter righted. There was no answer to it. The marriage lines were genuine and witnessed. The register leaf was in the dead parson's own undoubted hand and fitted the cut binding in the stolen book exactly. The confession was the late Duke's own, against the honest going of the clock and the proofs it had kept. The burned page and the smooth 3 years' lie simply fell to nothing. The Dowager Lady Wexmoor fought of course to the cold bitter last, as the Duke of Ravensmere had known she would. She cried tampering, and forgery, and the contrived malice of a stranger duke and a mad servant, with all the icy composure of her proud nature. But she was fighting now not a silent friendless girl but the plain proofs of a dead man, read out before an honest magistrate and the witness of the county, and traced and gathered and stood behind by one of the first men in the kingdom. And the more she fought, the worse it showed, for the magistrate had only to send for the stolen register book itself. Kept all this while among the late Duke's things the family had seized, and lay the recovered leaf against the telltale cut, and the thing was past all denying. The law moved, slowly and surely, the way the Duke of Ravensmere had set it moving. The suppression and theft of the register were laid bare, and the part the dowager's steward had played in it. And he, to save himself, told the rest. Within the year the false claim of base birth was overturned in form and in law. Rosamund was declared, before the world that had called her nobody, the late Duke of Wexmoor's trueborn and only child and his lawful heir, the dukedom and Wexmoor and all that went with them, that had been 3 years in the wrong hands, were restored to her line. The man who had called himself the Duke of Wexmoor was a duke no longer, but plain Mr. Bertram Crane again, exposed and ridiculed before the very fashionable world whose admiration he had bought with another's genius. A man who had been shown before everyone unable to read the clock he had screwed his name to, and he left the county under a cloud of debt and mockery and was not much heard of after. And the Dowager Lady Wexmoor, the cold, clever architect of it all, faced with the proof of the theft of the register and her hand in it, escaped the worst of the law only by the mercy of the woman she had wronged, who would not, in the end, hound even her aunt to a prison cell, but she was stripped of the place and the consequence she had committed every cruelty to seize, reduced to the small jointure that was lawfully hers and not 1 penny more, and put out of Wexmoor to live in a narrow genteel poverty with her ruined son, which for a woman of her pride was a harder punishment than any the law could have set. And she went, and the great house was rid of her. But I have got ahead of the part you have stayed for, which is not the law nor the ruin of the wicked, but the woman herself, and the cold, proud man, and what grew between them out of that broken noon. For the Duke of Ravensmere had come to Wexmoor to buy a clock, and had stayed to break a lie and right a wrong, and somewhere in the long careful weeks of the doing of it, this exact and guarded man, who had loved wholly only 2 things in all his life, had come, almost against his own will and quite against his cold reputation, to love a third. He had not fallen for a face across a ballroom which was not in his nature. He had fallen, slowly and surely and for keeps, for a mind and a spirit, for the maker of a clock he had revered before he ever knew her name, for the straight-backed silent woman who had kept faith with the truth in a servant's apron for 3 years and never once groveled nor begged, for the fierce sorrowful intelligence of that first look across the hall, and the low clear dignity of I told them there was a register, and the sure tender knowing hands that moved over fine mechanism as his own did. He had found in the wronged daughter of Wexmoor the one thing his lonely exact heart had never thought to find in all the fashionable world, which was an equal, another creature who loved the truth of a made thing above its show, set down as he had always felt himself to be, alone in a world that loved only the show. And it had undone him, quietly and completely, and he knew it, and being an honest man he did not pretend otherwise to himself. But he was too honest a man, and too careful to press his own heart upon her in the hour of her vindication, when she was newly given back her name and her house, and stood in the full strange daylight of being herself again after 3 years in the dark. For he knew that a woman just freed from one person's power is owed, before all things, the room to be no one's but her own. And so the Duke of Ravensmere did a thing that earned him more, in the end, than any wooing could have done. He stood back. He saw her righted, and stood by her through the law, and asked nothing. And when it was done, and Wexmoor was hers and the false family gone, he made ready to take his cold, courteous leave and go home to the north, having, as he believed, no further claim to press, and no right to press one. And it was Rosamund, in the end, who stayed him. Rosamund, standing in the great hall that was hers again, beside the great clock that had given her back her name, who looked at the grave, lonely, honest man who had asked her for nothing and had given her everything, and understood him, as the county never had, exactly, and who said to him, quietly, that she had been 3 years unable to speak the truth, and meant never to be silent about a true thing again, and that the truth was that she did not want him to go. But, she said, and here she smiled, the first true smile that had been seen on her face in 3 years. She had also been 3 years a thing other people moved and used and disposed of without her asking. And she would not, even for him, even for the best man she had ever known, be quickly disposed of again, however kindly she would have first. A year. A year to be the Duke of Wexmoor's daughter in her own house, in her own right, answering to no one. A year to wind her father's clock every night as its mistress and not its servant. A year to be, at last and for the first time in her grown life, simply and wholly herself. And then, she said, if he was still of the same mind, and she rather thought she would be of hers, he might ask her again. And the Duke of Ravensmere, who understood her better than any man living, did not argue, and did not sulk, and did not press. He bowed his grave head and said that a thing worth having was worth waiting for the right time to have it, and that he had spent his life learning to wait for the one true moment and could surely wait one turning of the year for the truest. And he kissed her hand, and went home to the north, and wrote to her all that year letters about the heavens and the hours and the depthing of wheels, and, by slow degrees, about his heart. And she wrote back, and he waited, and kept faith. Exactly as her father's clock had kept faith, for the year to come round. And here, before the year turns and I tell you how it ended, I will say the thing this whole story has been about, because you have stayed all the way to her side and you have earned the saying of it plainly. They had taken everything from Rosamund Fenwick that the world thinks can be taken. Her house, her fortune, her father's name, the work of her own hands, and at the last her very birth, her place in the world, the simple truth of who she was. And they had been able to take all of it, every piece, save one, for there was one thing they could not reach, and it was not hidden in the clock, though the proof of it was. The thing they could not take was the truth itself. The bare fact that she was her father's true-born daughter, that she had built the great clock, that she was who she was. That fact sat in the world untouched all the 3 years they denied it, as a true thing sits untouched by any lie however loud, waiting only for the day someone would look closely enough to see it. They could burn the page that recorded the truth. They could not make the truth not so. They could screw another man's name to the clock, they could not make him its maker. They could call her nobody for 3 years to a county that believed them, they could not make her nobody. Not for one instant, not in the smallest degree. And in the end the truth did the only thing the truth ever needs to do, which is to keep. It kept. In the dark of a clock and in the heart of a silent woman, through 3 long years of being denied, until the one noon it was made to be spoken. And then it spoke, and every lie that had been built so cleverly against it simply ceased to stand, the way the dark ceases when you open the shutter. That is the thing worth carrying away from Rosamund's story, I think. Not that the wicked were punished, though they were, and not even that she was loved at last, though she was, but that a true thing well made, and well hidden, and faithfully kept, cannot in the end be unmade by any lie, but waits in the dark, patient as a clock, for the one noon the right light falls. The year turned, as years do, and the deep of winter came round again to Wexmoor, and with it the last week of January, and the noon of Rosamund's birthday, and the great clock, faithfully kept and faithfully wound all that year by the hand of its rightful mistress, struck the noon of her birthday once more, in the great hall of the house that was hers. But this time there was no fraud to break and no lie to undo. This time the little drawer behind the silvered moon, its work 3 years done, stayed empty and open, for Rosamund had given the particular and unalterable order that the small drawer the clock had sprung for her was never again to be closed, but kept open always behind the silvered moon, so that anyone who came to wonder at the famous Wexmoor clock should see the little open drawer, and ask, and be told the story of the maker who had hidden his daughter's name in the heart of his clock against the day she should have need, and of the noon it had given it back. And on that noon, in the bright winter hall, the Duke of Ravensmere, who had kept faith and kept his distance and waited out the full turning of the year exactly as she had asked, came again to Wexmoor, and this time he did not come to buy a clock, and this time the silent woman in the grey gown was nowhere to be found. For there was no longer any such person, there was only the Duke of Wexmoor's daughter, the mistress of the house, in a well-made gown of soft blue, standing straight and unafraid beside her father's clock in her own great hall, waiting for him. And he crossed the hall to her, and asked her again, as she had said he might. And she said yes. They were married in the spring, in the small old estate church where the late Duke had married twice, and where Rosamund had been baptized, the register made whole again and her name written plain in it where it had always belonged. And old Josiah Tench, the faithful workman, stood near the front, and old Mr. Sefton the solicitor, who had believed her when no one asked him to. And there was no one there who did not know by then the whole story, of the Trueborn daughter called Nobody, and the cold Duke who could not abide a lie, and the great clock that kept the truth in the dark until the one noon it was made to speak. She carried, at her wedding, no grand bouquet, but a single sprig of rosemary, for remembrance, in honor of the father who had hidden her name where no liar could reach it. And she wore at her throat his plain silver pocket watch, the one she had wound every night through all the hard years, keeping his time. And the two of them, the astronomer Duke and the clockmaker who was a duke's daughter, who had each thought themselves alone in a world that cared only for the show of things, were alone no longer, and they kept, between Wexmoor and the great estate in the north, two of the finest sets of clocks and instruments in the kingdom, and worked at the bench together of an evening as she had once worked with her father, two true makers keeping faith with the truth of made things. And in the fullness of time the line of Wexmoor went on, true-born and unbroken, through the daughter they had tried so hard to make Nobody. And the great clock of Wexmoor keeps its faithful time in the great hall to this day, they say, wound every night, never let to run down, with the little drawer behind the silvered moon kept open as its mistress ordered, to the end of her long life and beyond it. And on the one noon in all the year that it was made to speak, on the deep winter birthday of the woman it gave a name back to, the old people of the county will tell you, if you ask them, that the great clock strikes its noon a little prouder than on any other day, though that of course is only a fancy, for a clock keeps the same true time on every day alike. But it is a fancy worth keeping, I think, like the open drawer. For a clock that has once kept the truth so faithfully in the dark has surely earned the right to be thought, on the one day in the year that it spoke, to strike a little prouder. That was tonight's chapter from Candlelit Chapters. If her story moved you, snuff the candle gently and join me for the next.